If you've been preparing for the CISSP exam using the 2018 materials, then you're probably looking for a video that will clarify and dive into what's really new in the 2021 exam, and to help you onboard those new concepts. The good news is your effort to date is not wasted. The changes are incremental. So what we need here is not a whole new set of lessons, but a lesson to present the new concepts that have surfaced in those incremental changes of the 2021 exam. This is that video. And if you've watched others in my series, you know I don't waste words. We get right to the point because my objectives are to help you minimize your prep time, minimize the money you spend to get prepared, and to ensure you pass that exam on the first attempt, or if we're just meeting and you've tried before, on your next attempt. So if you're preparing to take the CISSP exam after May 1st, 2021, follow me, my friends, and I'll show you the way. So whether you are just beginning to prepare for the CISSP exam or you've been already studying with the 2018 materials, this video will serve as the bridge that gives you the incremental drill down on new 2021 topics and the roadmap to prepare for the exam before the official study guides come out, which is going to be a few weeks. So let's talk about the new syllabus for 2021, which is not much different than the earlier versions in 2018. So there's no change in experience requirements or the number of domains. In fact, the domain names are the same. The content in some of the domains has been expanded, which is expected, right? Virtually no change in domain weights, a couple of 1% shifts. No major changes in the linear exam, which you'd see outside the US potentially. No change in the CAT exam, the adaptive exam that you'd see in the States. But as I mentioned, domains have been expanded and some new topics have been introduced in these domains to just keep up with changing times, right? And in some cases, you'll find topics that were actually covered in 2018 have made an appearance in the syllabus itself in the exam description, which would simply mean that they have elevated the importance of those. So perhaps you'll see a bit more content on those topics. The domain weight, you'll see there's just a 1% shift there, right? So we see that we went to 11% in domain 8 and we dropped 1% in domain 4. This matters not in your preparation, right? Non-event. So the point being, the additions to the exam are incremental. Existing prep and materials are still valid. The updated official study guide from ISC Squared that they published through CyBEX is due out in late May, and the practice questions are currently listed as coming out in late June. So if you'd like to keep on preparing, you should do so. This video is designed to provide that bridge to give you some drill down on the newer concepts and to point out the incremental changes in each of the 8 domains. The official study guide, I'll have links to the 2018 and 2021 guides in the video description. I absolutely recommend the bundle. The 2018 bundle came with more than 1,000 practice questions, lots of flashcards, I believe 700 flashcards. So a great study resource for less than $60. Where are you going to get that many practice questions for such a low cost? So the course series that this will lead into is an 8-part series in terms of core lessons. So we'll touch on domains 1 through 8. And those videos are already published earlier in 2021. And those domain names have not changed in the 2021 version of the exam, as you saw. So you want to go through these core lessons for sure. Now also, our Exam Cram series has a number of shorter supplemental lessons. These are equally important because they are drilling down, providing additional focus to especially challenging areas. And this comes largely from request. So Hack Your Exam Prep outlines my approach to preparing for this exam. And I went into CISSP with a lot of experience, so it took me a couple of weeks. I will admit I am quite unusual, but my strategy will help you prepare faster, I can promise you that. Memorization tips, so some techniques to help in the heavy memorization areas. A video on the quantitative risk analysis formulas in practice. So I had more than one request to really show these formulas in action. There you have it. Drill down on crypto, a discussion of models, processes, and frameworks, lots of process steps to memorize for sure. Attacks and countermeasures. So there's some increased focus on attacks and countermeasures. This video is dedicated to that. And really, countermeasures is one area that I found is missing even in some of the study materials out there that folks are using. So I wanted to have a drill down to really talk about that. So absolutely worth your time. I've had multiple students tell me this video right here, Mastering the CISSP Mindset, most important video they watched in preparing for the exam. When you hear that question, how do you think like a manager? This video is going to tell you how you think like a manager in quantifiable terms. We will walk through some practice questions to show how we apply that mindset on exam day. Watch this video, please. And as always, a PDF copy of this presentation will be available in the video description, as it is for all of my CISSP Exam Cram lessons. And if you are interested, I have a practice CISSP quiz available for you free in the video description, no login required. And that being said, let's get to it. So Domain 1, Security and Risk Management. So what's new here? Well, in Domain 1, item 1.1 on the syllabus, understand, adhere to, and promote professional ethics. This is a non-event. In the 2018 version of the exam, you were asked to know the ISC Squared Code of Ethics. When we talk about the most important consideration in all of our decisions, human safety is the answer, right? That is ethical behavior. You can think about ethics in the context of due diligence and due care, sometimes known as the prudent man rule. So nothing really changes here in terms of what you need to study, conceptually speaking. And that just calls to light the fact that some existing topics may be getting more attention. Just because a technology gets called out in the syllabus itself where it didn't before doesn't mean it wasn't covered before. You'll see multiple examples of that in this video. So let's move on to Domain 2, which is Asset Security. So here we see 2.3, Provision Resources Securely, 2.4, Managing the Data Lifecycle, and 2.6, Determining Data Security Controls and Compliance Requirements. DRM, CASB, and DLP, those were covered in the 2018 material. Clearly, they've been elevated to some degree here. And in a world of identity-focused security and zero trust, it's not surprising, right? Our network perimeter doesn't exist as it used to. And you're going to hear provisioning resources securely in various capacities through the 8 domains. Managing the data lifecycle is the item I want to call attention to in Domain 2. So it was mentioned in a phrase in 2018. It's clearly going to get a little more attention. So here is the data lifecycle, and you see it begins with creation, then store, use, share, archive, and destroy. Now I want to call your attention to a similar lifecycle that existed in 2018, and it exists in the 2021 version of the course. In Domain 7, in Security Operations, we have the information lifecycle, and what you're going to see here are some commonalities. So you'll notice creation, you'll notice archival and destruction, usage, and storage. What's different here is you notice classification. So the information lifecycle, it focuses a bit more on information protection, because you don't see classification called out explicitly in the data lifecycle, right? So another item called out in Domain 7 around the information lifecycle that's important for you to remember is there isn't a consistent standard used to identify each stage or phase of a data lifecycle. So conceptually speaking, what I would suggest you know for the exam is that immediately after creation, it's very important that we classify data, because classification tells us the requirements for protection. And the other key elements that I want you to notice here is that each of these cycles includes archival and destruction, right? So archival is important because certain regulatory requirements will demand that we have data that we keep around for a period of time in a retrievable state. It could be a year, it could be 7 years. And data destruction is important because data that remains around longer than is necessary creates risk and it creates liability. It can be stolen, it can be called as evidence. It can be discovered as evidence for legal actions. So more than remembering the steps here, I want you to remember those key elements of the data lifecycle or the information lifecycle. The information lifecycle is covered both in Domain 7 and it's also covered in the Processes and Frameworks video in depth, but knowing these will serve you well. But you want to know those, you want to be familiar with those practical elements of the data lifecycle. And then you'll also see in Domain 2 in that core lesson, you'll see some discussion around data classification there, so I'm not going to go into it here. I want you to go check that out in Domain 2. And Domain 3, Security Architecture and Engineering, is a big domain, and there are several changes here. So under Item 3.1, which is Research, Implement, and Manage Engineering Processes Using Secure Design Principles, we see several concepts here called out that were present in the 2018 exam. Threat modeling, least privilege, defense in depth, secure defaults, fail securely, separation of duties. However, we see several net new concepts here as well. Keep it simple, zero trust, privacy by design, trust but verify, and shared responsibility. I'm going to cover these for you now. Okay, I'm going to cover these for you in a minute because first I want to point out the other syllabus line item in Domain 3 that is new, and that is 3.7, Understand Methods of Cryptanalytic Attacks. And again, quite a large number of attacks mentioned. Most of these existed in the 2018 version of the exam. It's clearly a topic that's getting more attention. These attacks are covered in the Attacks and Countermeasures supplemental lesson. They are also covered in line in their specific domains where they were applicable. And what do I mean by in the domains where applicable? Well, for example, Domain 5 is Identity and Access Management. We'll talk about access control attacks in Domain 5. But if you'd like to go through attacks and countermeasures all in one setting, go check out that supplemental lesson, and that will serve you well. In fact, there's the thumbnail you want to look for on that supplemental video in the playlist. So let's get into some of those new concepts that I mentioned are present in Domain 3. We'll start with Zero Trust Security, which is a strategy, an approach that addresses the limitations of the legacy network perimeter-based security model, where the firewall was the perimeter, right? So with work from home and mobile devices, our users are everywhere, right? So really, Zero Trust Security typically treats the user identity as the control plane. So you'll hear it in marketing documents. They'll say the identity is the new perimeter. Zero Trust assumes compromise or breach in verifying every request. So basically, no entity is trusted by default. We're verifying identity, managing devices, managing apps, and protecting data in all phases of operation. So in that category of secure design principles, secure defaults is called out in 2021. So this simply means default configuration represents a restrictive and secure configuration. And this should apply not only in your own configurations within your organization, but you should expect the same of your hardware, software, and service vendors, that their service, their device, their software is secure by default. It's a reasonable expectation in 2021. Fail securely, which simply means that when a component fails, it should fail in a state that denies access rather than granting access. These two concepts are actually taken from NIST SP 800-160, which is the considerations for a multidisciplinary approach in the engineering of trustworthy, secure systems. This is actually a decent read to thumb through, but that's where those concepts came from, was that NIST security. So privacy by design comes up. So making privacy an integral part of every system, your policies, your design process. The best guidance I can give you here comes from the International Association of Privacy Professionals, who have published 7 principles of privacy. So privacy as a proactive approach, something we consider from the moment we are envisioning a new service or product. Privacy as the default setting. right? It's not something that has to be opted in. It's something you would want to have folks opt out of. So privacy is the default. Privacy should be embedded in the design, not bolted on later. So it should be considered from the design phase. Principle number 4 is that privacy should be a positive sum approach, not a zero sum approach. And you might be asking, well, what in the heck is a positive sum approach? A positive sum occurs when an approach is formulated where the needs of everybody involved are met. So when we implement privacy in our design, we as an organization create a more effective, more secure service, and our customers benefit because we have considered their privacy from the beginning. So another way of saying positive sum, I would say, is you're creating a win-win scenario. End-to-end full life cycle data protection, right? We talked about data life cycle, so protecting our sensitive data, making sure that after data is created, it's classified and protected, super important. Visibility and transparency. There are many ways to facilitate visibility and transparency. For example, if I'm a software company, I have a privacy policy that explains to a user what data I am collecting from that user and what I am doing with that data. So transparency can be communicated through policy and implemented in features of a service or software, what have you. And keeping privacy user-centric. When I think about user-centric privacy, I think about GDPR. So GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation. It's the EU's data protection law. And in GDPR, the user has the right to instruct me as a company to forget them. So in GDPR regulations, I do have to be transparent in my privacy policies. The user has the right to request all data that I have collected about them, and they have the right to tell me as an organization to forget them, to basically lose their information, lose my number. And again, I think from a cybersecurity perspective, these are just sensible principles anyway. So applying these principles and implementing a layered defense in depth, we'd call it, as part of a zero trust strategy, just ensures privacy end to end. So I think these are good principles that help you onboard the concept of privacy by design. Keep it simple is not a new concept. This is a concept that's been around for a very long time, and it applies to much more than just cybersecurity. So Bruce Schneier mentioned once upon a time that complexity is the worst enemy of security. Complexity is the worst enemy of many things, and a simple design is the best design. We justify the addition of complexity. So in the world of cloud and hybrid security services that leverage, AI in the cloud, machine learning, a best-in-suite over best-in-breed approach is generally considered the best way to simplify defense in depth, because the security suites from the various cloud-focused security vendors will incorporate layers of intelligence that together are better in securing your environment. And this simplicity also helps to avoid configuration mistakes. It means that your layers are going to be integrated better. It means that your overall solution is, generally speaking, going to be smarter. It does not mean that you're going to have only one security vendor. It means that you will likely have fewer security vendors, but you will have some sort of suite that will serve as the foundation for your organization. And whether your foundation is based on Microsoft or Google or Cisco or Amazon, that's not so important as the concept in this case. But this enables organizations to move forward, incrementally rather than demanding perfection. It's really a fresh application of the classic keep it simple, silly principle. That's the KISS principle that they taught us when we were kids. Honestly, when I was a kid, it was keep it simple, stupid. But we're more polite now, and so we don't say stupid. But when I think about maintaining simplicity in designing a cybersecurity strategy, these are some tips that I think you'll find helpful, but really never underestimate the value of incremental improvement rather than demanding perfection out of the box. Because when we choose a best-in-breed strategy and we try to go find the best vendor at every layer, we spend a lot of time shopping. We spend a lot of time trying to determine how well those solutions integrate with one another. It becomes a lot of work, a lot of expense, and a lot of complexity. So security as a service, this is a cloud provider concept where the security is provided to an organization through or by an online entity. This definition would be applicable to all of those providers that I mentioned just a moment ago. Internet of Things. So these are a class of devices connected to the internet to provide automation, remote control, AI processing in a home or a business setting. We all have IoT devices, plugs, thermostats, assistants, speakers, you name it. So more scenarios involving IoT devices are likely to appear on the 2021 exam. Smart devices, mobile devices that offer customization, typically through installing apps and might use on device or in the cloud AI processing. There are all sorts of devices that can be considered smart devices, from smartphones to smart thermostats to doorbells to sensors used in manufacturing scenarios to predict device failure before a device fails. And one would think, generally speaking, on the CISSP exam, the context, the examples around smart devices and IoT will be more business focused than they would be focused on home scenarios. So next we're going to talk about SIEM and SOAR. So SIEM is Security Information Event Management. So think of a SIEM solution as a system that's going to collect data from many sources within your network. It's going to take sign-in logs from identity and access management. It's going to take syslog and common event format data from your network devices. It's going to take event logs from your endpoint. It's going to take various bits of telemetry from security solutions within your environment, and it's going to provide real-time monitoring and analysis, typically using AI and machine learning and UBA, user entity behavioral and analytics, and to give you notification of potential attacks. So SOAR, Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response, is centralized alert and response automation, generally with threat-specific playbooks. And what I mean by threat-specific playbooks is the form of automation may be very different from different vendors, but the automation will be threat-specific, generally speaking, because specific threats require specific responses, whether that's a particular type of script or automation tool. And the response might be fully automated, or sometimes you'll see these solutions come semi-automated out of the box, where essentially the potential attack is identified, and then the SOAR solution gives you the click here to remediate sort of response. And SOAR is actually mentioned in Domain 8. So why am I talking about it here? Well, I'm talking about it here because SIEM and SOAR nowadays are very commonly delivered together as components in a single solution. So I wanted to talk about them in context, because the SIEM part of the equation is going to be doing the monitoring, the analysis, and the notification. The SOAR is the response automation, whether automated or fully automated or partially automated. But I wanted to bring this up earlier in the discussion because in terms of context, it fits here better than in Domain 8, in my opinion. So and on the exam, you're not taking the questions aren't coming to you domain at a time. So functionally speaking, I just wanted to get this out in the open here now. But these solutions today are often going to use AI and ML and threat intelligence to come to their conclusions, to aid in their analysis. We'll talk about threat intelligence in just a moment. So microservices and service-oriented architecture, SOA, may come up on the exam in 2021. So SOA is the creation of discrete services that can be accessed by users in a black box fashion. So basically, we don't know what's going on under the hood. SOA is a concept that's a few years old. You don't hear near as much about it anymore. It's really been superseded by microservices, which are fine-grained services with a discrete function. I think of microservices as a more modern adaptation of SOA that's better oriented to cloud computing. Many times you'll find microservices are built in a fashion that they are containerized so they can run on a container platform like Docker or in Kubernetes. And it's important that we identify code level vulnerabilities early in the development lifecycle, so before software is released. You can do this with a combination of static code analysis and dynamic testing, basically early in your integration and delivery process, so we can identify deficiencies before the release. So another way to say static code analysis is static application security testing. We're going to talk about that in the changes that come in Domain 8, and dynamic testing also, dynamic application security testing. So we'll touch on those two in Domain 8 in greater depth. So containerization may come up on the exam, and this is really talking about technologies like Docker and Kubernetes. Kubernetes really being the de facto industry standard now when it comes to containerization. So this is a lightweight, granular, and portable way to package applications for multiple platforms. And it's going to reduce the overhead of server virtualization by allowing a containerized app to run on a shared OS kernel. So we can have multiple applications that are containerized running on the same virtual machines. Containers don't have their own operating system. They are sharing the operating system of the container host on which they run, which is going to be a Linux server typically, or sometimes occasionally a Windows server, Linux being the more common container host. Now, when we get into that more granular level of sharing an operating system, we still have many of the same concerns we have around server virtualization, in that we need isolation for our applications, at a host level, at a process level, at a network level, at a storage level. And you can imagine in shared environments, we might not be comfortable running containerized applications in the same clusters. And so you'll hear discussions around not just logical separation, but physical isolation as well. And really, DevOps security is really going to focus on the container level. We think about application level security, so authentication and authorization. We'll talk more about these as we move along here. So application programming interfaces, or APIs, may come up on the exam, with REST being the modern standard for API development. SOAP was the standard in years past. But an API is a set of exposed interfaces that allows for programmatic interaction between services. Back in the early days of Amazon, Jeff Bezos laid down a standard for his technology groups that when they built a service, they had to package that service and make it available for other teams, other products, business units, etc., for their consumption as well. So REST, the modern standard I mentioned, uses the HTTPS protocol for web communications to offer those API endpoints. All your communication between client and server should be encrypted, and your access should be limited with API keys, which means you also need to ensure that storage, distribution, and transmission of those access keys is done in a secure fashion, because that's effectively a secret. If you've never played around with an API, you could go sign up for a developer account on Twitter, for example, or Facebook, and get into an example of working with an API. Embedded systems, another potential exam topic coming about through the rise of the Internet of Things. So an embedded system is a technology component of an IoT device. Think of it as a full computer system embedded inside another larger system. Good examples of this, printers typically have embedded systems. GPS, drones, semi-autonomous vehicles, they have a full computer system that's embedded inside that larger system. And with embedded devices, you'll need to consider authentication practices to ensure they meet with security best practices. You want to avoid implied trust. So high performance computing, another potential exam topic. So this is an alternative to client server computing for compute intensive operations with large data sets that typically require large-scale parallel processing. The SETI project, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, is a good example of high-performance computing, where individuals can volunteer their compute time to help process data. So grid computing, which is high-performance computing we often see in a business setting, employs a centralized controller that makes computing assignments to grid members. And in a grid computing example, we have some security concerns, particularly around that grid controller, making sure that that grid controller is safe from bad actors or that the grid can't be used for illicit activities, which means there needs to be some governance built in as to how assignments are made and what compute tasks can be assigned. So edge computing may come up, and edge computing really speaks to operations that require processing activities to occur locally, far from the cloud. So this is really common in IoT scenarios, the agricultural space, science and space, military. I even see it in retail scenarios. Fog computing places a gateway device in the field to collect and correlate data centrally at the edge. So fog computing is kind of a nuanced version of edge computing. I can think of an edge computing scenario like in watering plants in a field. I have sensors, IoT sensors that will, sense the moisture level and automate watering. So for those types of operations to happen in a timely way, I might need that to happen at the edge. I can think of retail scenarios where you go visit a kiosk in a drugstore, for example, to order, specially, crafted cards or photos right there at a kiosk. Edge processing could be very important in a good user experience. So with large, network device counts in varied locations, you want to think about data encryption, spoofing protection, and authentication to avoid bigger security problems. Because a large number of unsecured IoT devices can become somebody's bot army for distributed denial of service attacks. Right, now we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about cloud computing, which will definitely receive more attention on the 2021 version of the exam. So we'll talk about infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, so IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. And we'll talk about private, hybrid, and public cloud. And we will talk about the shared responsibility model. This is going to be key for the exam. So let's talk about shared responsibility. So when we are on-prem, responsibility for security is 100% ours, right? All the way down to the wire. In our data center, we are responsible. Now, when we begin to consume services in a public cloud scenario, who's responsible for which components shifts, and some of our responsibility for security is shifted to the CSP, the cloud service provider. So in an IaaS scenario, infrastructure as a service, think server virtualization, running virtual machines. The CSP is responsible from the wire up to that virtualization host. We are really deploying virtual machines and configuring and consuming at that level. We will have some responsibility for specific types of configurations to ensure availability, to ensure SLAs kick in, but you see there some responsibility has shifted. When we look at platform as a service, we see that we're giving up more responsibilities to the CSP here as well. Think of cloud database models. If I'm hosting a database in the cloud where I'm not responsible for the service that runs it, beyond some simple configuration of my database, if I'm thinking about web applications or functions that are hosted in a service, you'll notice here all the way up to the runtime belongs to the cloud service provider. And in a database scenario, I'm responsible for my data and the applications that are talking to my data. If we think about software as a service, we're giving away more responsibility yet. We're really just responsible for using and consuming the service. Office 365 is a great example of this. ServiceNow, the ITSM platform, great responsibility. So you notice as we move into the cloud, we're handing over some of that responsibility for security and management to the CSP, which is a good thing for us. So just some examples here and some details to help you cement the shared responsibility model. So in the IS scenario, the CSP, the cloud service provider, is providing the building blocks like the networking, the storage, the compute. They manage the staff and the hardware and the data center for us, right? So good examples of this: Azure Virtual Machines, Amazon EC2, Google Cloud Platform Compute Engine. PaaS, Platform as a Service. The customer is responsible for deployment and management of the app. So that's we are the customer in that scenario. The CSP manages the provisioning, the configuration, the hardware, the operating system, even more underlying details. Good examples here: Azure SQL databases, Azure API management, Azure App Service, which is running web apps, again in a fashion where we're not worried about servers. So before we move on to software as a service, I want to touch for a moment on the difference in responsibility and functionality between serverless and platform as a service. So serverless may also be called function as a service. So let's take a web application. When I deploy a web application, let's say I'm a restaurant and I have a web application that has a menu function and an ordering function, for example. In a PaaS scenario, I'm going to deploy that application into the service. I'm typically going to have to pick a service tier. Now in its PaaS, it's platform as a service, so I'm not worried about servers or any of that, but I'll have to decide if I want dedicated environment. I'll have to pick some service tier that gives me an idea of scale. Now, function as a service allows us to break this down one level even more granular, I'd say. So let's say if I want to move my restaurant application into function as a service, I might break that menu out as one function, and then I break the ordering function out separately, and I send that code to my function as a service provider. They handle the provisioning and they handle the scale. So what it would do is allow the individual components of my application in that scenario to scale independently, but in a function as a service scenario, I'm not worried at all about the scale. The platform is handling that behind the scenes for me. So function as a service allows me to make even fewer decisions around service tier and scale and so forth. It's giving me a more granular way to break that up versus platform as a service, which is a level more granular than and less responsibility than infrastructure as a service, where we were handling virtual machines. So different platforms have different names for it. So Microsoft, for example, in Azure, they call it it's Azure Functions. In AWS, on the Amazon platform, it's AWS Lambda, I believe. But what they are both is event-driven serverless computing platforms. All right, so let's talk about software as a service. So in the software as a service scenario, we're handing even more responsibility over to the CSP. So in this case, we as the customer just configure features, right? The CSP is responsible for management, operation, and availability of the service. So good examples of software as a service that you'd be familiar with would include Office 365, ServiceNow, and Salesforce. All right, now I want to shift gears and talk about cloud models for a moment. And I just want to acquaint you with the differences between public, private, and hybrid cloud models. So we'll start with public cloud. So this is where everything runs on the cloud provider's hardware. So the advantages here would include scalability. We can scale infinitely in the cloud, at least in theory, right? Greater agility, because we don't have to make capital purchases in order to deploy new infrastructure. We can push a few buttons and deploy new infrastructure in the cloud. And what you're doing in a public cloud scenario is trading some capital expense, which would be investment in your data center, for what we'd call operational expense. So just paying as we go for services in the cloud, for infrastructure in the cloud. So that pay for what you consume model. And it allows us to scale more easily, more quickly, less maintenance, and it lowers the skills bar because we don't have to have maybe quite the same server expertise and network expertise in our organization. So this is a great equalizer for smaller organizations. Private cloud. So this is a cloud environment in your own data center. So server clusters, virtualization clusters, maybe running VMware or Hyper-V, for example. The advantages here include that we have legacy support. We have control over that environment. We can establish the conditions for regulatory compliance. So really in private cloud, if I had to put it in a word, it's really control there, because when we're working in a public cloud model, typically you're working on the latest version of a service. In a private cloud scenario, we can control the pace of versioning. We can control configurations to establish compliance for specific scenarios. So when legacy comes up, private cloud is a good answer. So hybrid cloud combines these two. So it allows us to have the best of both worlds. So we can run our applications in the right location. If we need to support legacy for a time, we can have a private cloud where we run those applications. If we have modern apps that we've containerized or that can run in a PaaS or a serverless environment, we can run those in the public cloud. And quite often you will find that the private cloud in the data center is connected to the public cloud in some respects, perhaps with some sort of VPN or private network connectivity that connects the two entities, so you can have communication between them. For example, if you have applications in the public cloud that need to talk to services in your private cloud. So the hybrid cloud allows you to move into cloud computing, into public cloud at your own pace. So there I'm really speaking to the advantages. The main advantage is flexibility in running our legacy scenarios and dealing with specific compliance and scalability scenarios. We can move at our own pace, which allows us to take on that additional work. Whether that work is migrating an app or recoding an app, we can take on that additional work at our convenience. So a cloud access security broker, or CISSP for short, may come up on the exam. This was a topic in the 2018 study materials. I expect it gets more attention in 2021 due to the rise of cloud computing. So a CISSP is a security policy enforcement solution. So we can enforce policies like ensuring that users only use the approved applications we have in place. We can prevent sensitive information from being shared externally, from being stored in cloud storage repositories that we don't approve. CISSPs vary widely in their functionality. The CISSP industry came about to solve one problem, and that is the problem of shadow IT. The scenario where organizations, business units within organizations would go out and they would work around the IT department to find applications or services to help them get their job done, and they would purchase those on their corporate cards, for example, and have a whole new way of doing things in some cases that the IT department didn't have any control over, any governance over, or knowledge of. But when you're thinking about CISSP, think security policy enforcement and think shadow IT prevention. So word has it, the 2021 version of the CISSP exam may bring questions about post-quantum cryptography and quantum-resistant algorithms. So what is post-quantum cryptography exactly? Well, it's the development of new kinds of cryptographic approaches that can be implemented using today's conventional computers, but that will be resistant to attacks from tomorrow's quantum computers. So first two questions that come to mind are which algorithms are susceptible and which algorithms are resistant. Well, let's start by looking at the two classes, but first let me give you a quick disclaimer here. So number one, I am not a professional cryptographer, nor am I a professional cryptologist. However, I'm providing you information from solid authoritative sources, including the likes of Bruce Schneier, who you may know as a well-known public cybersecurity figure. He also happens to be the creator of the Blowfish and Twofish cryptographic algorithms, and Joel Alwyn, who's a pretty widely published cryptographer who puts some focus in the area of quantum. And I'll have links to both of their articles in the video description if you're interested in reading further. But moving forward, How well do current encryption algorithms hold up to the power of quantum computing? So let's take our two major types here: symmetric, which is shared key cryptography, and then asymmetric or public key. So symmetric, the shared key, is what we use for bulk encryption of data, and asymmetric has uses like key exchange and digital signatures. So symmetric holds up fairly well to quantum computing, and we'll explore that more in just a moment. Where quantum poses more immediate threats to asymmetric. So let's unpack symmetric first. So Grover's algorithm shows that a quantum computer speeds up attacks to effectively halve the key length. Grover's algorithm is a quantum algorithm for unstructured search that basically, with a very high probability, can identify the unique input for a given output. And basically that would mean that a 256-bit key is as strong against a quantum computer as a 128-bit key is against a conventional computer. And so you may ask yourself, well, wait a minute, a quantum computer is only twice as powerful as a conventional? No, a 256-bit key is not twice as strong as a 128-bit. The 256-bit key is 2 to the 128th times as strong. Because doubling your length increases the possible combinations exponentially. So let's talk about asymmetric, so public key cryptography. So on this side, we have Shor's algorithm, which is a quantum algorithm for integer factorization, can easily break all of the commonly used public key algorithms based on both factoring, which means RSA is vulnerable because that RSA depends on factoring of large primes, and the discrete logarithm problem, which means that elliptic curve is vulnerable because that's the problem it's based on. So Schneier points out that doubling the key length in the asymmetric scenario increases the difficulty to break by a factor of 8, which is not a sustainable advantage. So the good news for the future here is that lattice offers some resistance and some real promise for quantum resistant algorithms. So it's based on different types of problems, the shortest vector problem and the closest vector problem. And according to Alwyn, it potentially enables us to replace essentially all of our currently endangered cryptographic schemes. And lattice-based cryptographic schemes make up the lion's share of scientific publications on post-quantum cryptography. And this bit of information comes from NIST's post-quantum cryptography competition, which they announced in 2016. And in July of 2020, so last year, NIST announced round 3 finalists. And the bulk of the finalists are of the lattice type. And that is to say, research, selection, and standards development is ongoing. And you might ask yourself, what exactly is a lattice? Well, a lattice is a three-dimensional array of regularly spaced points. An example of a lattice is the image you see right there. So for the exam, if you see a question asking for which types of public key algorithms are quantum resistant, the answer is lattice. So that's it for Domain 3. Quite a lot of potential uplift there in prepping for the 2021 version of the CISSP. So now we'll shift gears and we'll talk about Domain 4, which is communication and network security. Definitely a few new topics here. So 4.1 on the syllabus is assess and implement secure design principles in network architectures. So microsegmentation is a topic here. So this includes software-defined networks, virtual extensible LANs, software-defined wide area networks, SD-WANs they're called. Wireless networks will come up. Now, satellite was mentioned at least briefly in the 2018 version of the exam. I do want to touch on Li-Fi and Zigbee that could come up on the new exam. And then cellular networks. I want to talk about 5G in particular and security concerns around 5G in particular, how 5G relates back to legacy versions of cellular. And then we'll touch on content distribution networks, or CDNs. So let's start with virtual extensible LANs, or VXLANs. So this is network virtualization that enables network segmentation at high scale. Specifically, what this does is helps us solve a scale limitation in VLANing, where we can only create 4,096 VLANs versus in VXLAN we can create millions of VXLANs. And this is really a tunneling protocol that encapsulates an Ethernet frame, a layer 2 frame, in a UDP packet. And layer 2 can generally only be attacked from within, MAC spoofing or flooding to cause denial of service, such as by a rogue host. The attack vectors are actually explained to some degree in RFC 7348, which is the RFC where the VXLAN concept is described. So let's shift gears and talk about software-defined network. So this is an architecture approach that enables a network to be intelligently and centrally controlled or programmed, basically using software. So it has the capacity to reprogram the data plane at any time. So use cases where we see SDN come into play are SD-LAN and SD-WAN. So this is really separating the control plane from the data plane, and it's going to open up a number of potential security challenges. So SDN vulnerabilities can include man-in-the-middle attacks and denial of service attacks. So we secure an SDN with TLS, so encryption helps essentially. SD-WAN, so one of the use cases for the SDN concept, that's a software-defined wide area network. This enables users in branch offices to remotely connect to an enterprise's network. But what it enables is the use of a variety of network services, from MPLS to cellular to broadband, to securely connect users to applications. And security is largely based on IP security, VPN tunnels, next-gen firewalls, and micro-segmentation of your application traffic. But SD-WAN uses a centralized control function for intelligent routing, and there's a concept called Secure Access Service Edge, or SAS, to decentralize connectivity where necessary. Li-Fi, so light fidelity. So Li-Fi is a form of wireless networking that uses modulation of light intensity to transmit data. It uses LED lights, essentially. It can safely function in areas that are otherwise susceptible to electromagnetic interference. And theoretically, Li-Fi can transmit at speeds of up to 100 gigabits or higher. So Li-Fi only requires working LED lights. That's a big advantage. And then the reality is visible light can't penetrate opaque walls. So we can think of that as a negative for connectivity, right? Because a wall is a barrier. We might, on the other hand, think of that as a positive in certain security scenarios, because it means, light doesn't penetrate opaque walls. So if you're outside those walls, you're not a threat, right? You don't hear about Li-Fi much today. So I think it's still in development, is a fair statement, and we may see Li-Fi come into more widespread use down the road. There's certainly some scenarios where using light over traditional radio would be a big advantage. So let's talk for a moment about Zigbee, which is a personal area network. So this is a short-range wireless PAN developed to support automation, machine-to-machine communication, and remote control and monitoring of IoT devices. It supports a centralized or a distributed security model and mesh topology. It does assume that symmetric keys that are used with the devices are transmitted securely, that they're encrypted in transit. There's a pre-configuration of a new device in which a single key might be sent unprotected, which can create a brief vulnerability. So where do people use Zigbee? Zigbee is in widespread use in IoT smart home hub scenarios. So an Amazon Echo, for example, Alexa, your personal assistant, your Amazon Echo devices are Zigbee ready. So we see Zigbee in widespread use in smart home scenarios, but that can carry over into commercial scenarios, into business scenarios as well, for IoT device monitoring and control. Another new concept for 2021 comes with the rise of fifth generation cellular, so 5G. So 5G brings faster speeds, lower latency, no longer identifying each device through a SIM card. Now there are some air interface threats like session hijacking that are dealt with in 5G. Now there's a standalone version of 5G and a non-standalone version, and the standalone version of 5G will be more secure than the non-standalone, because the non-standalone version anchors the control signaling of the 5G network to the 4G core. So you're relying on a legacy technology there essentially. So the diameter protocol, which provides authentication, authorization, and accounting in 5G, will potentially be an attack target. And because 5G has to work alongside older tech, 3G and 4G specifically, old vulnerabilities could be targeted. And because of the scale of endpoint counts on 5G being exponentially greater, distributed denial of service can be a concern. So some carriers, some cellular carriers originally launched an NSA version of 5G, which continues to rely on availability of that 4G core. So that problem will go away in time. So we'll close out Domain 4 by talking about content delivery network. So a content delivery network is a geographically distributed network of proxy servers and the data centers they live in. The goal of a CDN is fast and highly available content delivery. Basically distributes the content out so it's closer to the user. CDN networks that serve up JavaScript have been targeted to inject malicious content into pages, for sure. But vendors in the CDN space typically offer DDoS protection and web app firewalls. A couple of common examples of content delivery networks would be for video and audio streaming, or for software download services, where you need to move a lot of content to a user quickly for a good user experience. That's where a CDN can come in really handy, because it caches that content out where it's closer to the end user. So let's talk about what's new in Domain 5, which is identity and access management. So if we look at 5.6, which is implement authentication systems, we have OpenID Connect and Open Authorization, or OAuth. OAuth 2 is what we'd be talking about in today's world. SAML, Security Assertion Markup Language, Kerberos, Radius, TACACS. These are all topics that existed in the 2018 version of the exam. This is a new subdomain, so new subdomain, existing topics equals greater focus in my mind. Although not specifically called out in this subdomain, I want to talk about certificate authentication because I think it's relevant, so we're going to cover it briefly. So let's dig into Domain 5. So identity as a service may come up. So identity as a service is where organizations move some or all of their identity and access management infrastructure to the cloud. So for example, if you're running Office 365, Azure Active Directory is providing your identity. So that's identity as a service. And really what that does is, as a service, is simplifies integration with your on-premises identity provider, like Active Directory is really common, your Active Directory domain on-prem. And you can deliver advanced features more easily, like multi-factor authentication, configuring privileged identity management functions like access reviews. And a lot of these identity as a service platforms will have artificial intelligence and machine learning to evaluate risk around your access attempts. This has some other advantages. It reduces the need to staff identity specialists. A lot of times you'll find identity as a service delivered with cloud platforms like G Suite or Azure. So let's start with the last one first. Let's talk about certificate-based authentication. So digital certificates can actually be used as an authentication technique for a user, a service, or even device identities. So the certificates that are used in this process are really similar to the certificates you used to secure websites. They have both a public key and a private key. And they're generally issued by a certification authority in a public key infrastructure. You can create self-signed certificates, but you wouldn't normally do that for a production scenario. If you want to see how key exchange works, look at the asymmetric cryptography example in Domain 3 in the Security Architecture and Engineering session. I have two people and show a key exchange scenario there that will make it very clear how the public and private keys are used. So AAA protocols. There are several protocols that provide centralized authentication, authorization, and accounting services. That's the AAA. So a network access server is a client to a radius server, and a radius server provides that authentication, authorization, and accounting functionality. You'll see this very commonly in VPN scenarios. So these sorts of protocols that come up commonly in VPN scenarios, Radius is the one I see the most often, and it uses UDP and encrypts the password. And then you have TACACS, which uses TCP and encrypts the entire session. And then you have Diameter, which is actually based on Radius. It just improves some of the weaknesses of Radius, but it's not compatible with Radius. So Radius encrypts the password, TACACS encrypts the entire session, and Diameter is based on Radius but improves some of those weaknesses. So just know these come up in commonly in VPN scenarios. Remember, AAA VPN, Radius encrypts password, TACACS encrypts the entire session, and it's really for network access or remote access systems that use these sorts of protocols. So in network appliance and VPN scenarios. All right, Active Directory, Kerberos is the primary authentication mechanism there. It allows users to prove their identity, and it also provides a measure of confidentiality and integrity using symmetric key encryption. But these really aren't Kerberos' primary purpose. Its primary purpose is authentication. Kerberos doesn't necessarily include logging capability, so it doesn't provide accountability. Kerberos allows users to prove their identity, so it helps with confidentiality and integrity. So it helps with the C and the I, but not the A. Common Kerberos attacks include replay, pass the ticket, golden ticket, and one called Kerberosting. So pass the ticket is the one you'll hear the most about in the real world, and that's basically where the attacker is going to steal a valid Kerberos ticket that's already been created and issued and pass that from one system to another in order to gain access to resources. They'll use it as a mechanism to move laterally in your environment. And the replay attack we talk about in as well in the attacks and countermeasures session, which is really based on replaying a sequence that's captured off the wire. Single sign-on. This is a mechanism that allows subjects to authenticate once and access multiple objects without authenticating again. So authenticate once, access multiple times. Some common SSO methods and standards include SAML, Sesame, Kryptonite, OAuth, and OpenID. The three to know for the exam are going to be SAML, OAuth, and OpenID, really. So know the high-level scenarios where each of these fit, and you should be in good shape for the exam. We actually talk about these in Domain 5. I'm going to bring them up here simply because they were elevated into that syllabus. But SAML is an XML-based open standard data format for exchanging auth-n and auth-z, authentication and authorization data between parties, and in particular between an identity provider and a service provider. So OpenAuth, and we'll talk more about SAML in just a moment. I want to unpack the identity provider, service provider details. OAuth 2 is an open standard for authorization. It's commonly used as a way for internet users to log into third-party websites using an existing like Microsoft, Google, or Facebook identity without exposing their passwords. You probably use this every day, just accessing third-party services on the internet where you've authenticated with your Google account or your Microsoft Live ID without exposing your password, though. And then OpenID is an open standard. It provides decentralized authentication by allowing users to log into multiple unrelated websites with a single set of credentials maintained by a third-party service referred to as an OpenID provider. So it's using credentials maintained by a third-party service where OAuth is reusing your existing credentials. So that's probably the most important thing to remember there. SAML is pretty common in federation scenarios. We're seeing less of SAML today. OAuth 2 was developed by the IETF, and it's updated through the RFP process. So IETF is the Internet Engineering Task Force. RFP is request for proposal. And then OpenID is managed through the OpenID Foundation. So different standards, different governance, essentially. So let's unpack SAML just a bit. I mentioned I wanted to unpack SAML just a little further. So SAML allows browser-based single sign-on across a variety of systems. It enables the use of one set of credentials to log into many different websites, so not unlike what we heard with some of the other providers. And the authentication includes three parties: the principal, the identity provider, and the service provider. So the principal, generally the user, logs into single sign-on. The service provider checks the user's credentials with the identity provider, and then the identity provider sends the authorization and authentication messages back to the service provider. SAML transactions use XML for standardizing communications between the identity provider and service provider, essentially. So those are some key characteristics of SAML I would remember in case they come up on the exam. Remember the three parties. Remember SAML uses XML for standardizing communications, and I think that'll help you pick that out should it come up as an answer. While I'm repeating information that's not net new to the exam, but been elevated and fairly important, be very familiar with need to know. Subjects only get access to what they need to know for their work tasks and their job functions. Least privilege, so ensuring subjects are only granted the privileges they need to perform their work. And then separation of duties and responsibilities, so two or more employees splitting a task to ensure that one employee doesn't have end-to-end capability to control a process, potentially grant themselves privileged access, for example, and then access privileged resources, and then reverse that process. We talk about that in attacks and countermeasures because separation of duties is one way to prevent fraud. But I thought I'd just call these out quickly because they are fairly important. Know those critters for the exam. Modern approaches to least privilege. I wanted to set the stage for this as well, actually. So a more granular approach to least privilege that could come up is just in time. So especially in cloud services, on cloud platforms, we've seen the creation of a feature that is just in time, that allows temporary elevation of privilege, usually time limited, as it's needed, and then revoking the privilege at the end of the allowed window. So we'll see this in solutions that are focused on privileged identity management or privileged access management. So just in time is really kind of a feature of privileged identity management, PIM, or privileged access management, PAM. I just wanted to call this out as a granular approach to least privilege that may come up. These are sometimes implemented through ephemeral accounts or a broker and remove access strategy. I wouldn't worry too much about the details. Just really think of just-in-time access as temporary elevation of privilege, and then being revoked after usually a time-limited window. So let's talk about Domain 6. This is going to be a very short discussion because there's really nothing in the line of significant changes for Domain 6. So if you've studied Domain 6 already in the 2018 content that I created in 2021, nothing to see here really. So let's move on to Domain 7, which is security operations. And there are a few things we want to talk about here. So 7.4 in particular, securely provisioning resources, was removed. However, some new technologies and existing subdomains that you'll want to be familiar with, threat feeds, user and entity behavior analytics, UBA, next generation firewalls, web app firewalls, and the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence. So I'm just going to cover all of these for you now. These are net new concepts that show up in Domain 7. So modern firewalls. We have next generation firewalls, which protect web apps by filtering and monitoring HTTP traffic between a web app and the internet. And these typically protect against common attacks like cross-site scripting, cross-site forgery, so CSRF, cross-site forgery. Sometimes you'll see that abbreviated XSRF, so either way it's cross-site forgery, and then SQL injection attacks. And just to be crystal clear, there's CSRF, cross-site request forgery, just so the acronym makes good sense to you. Some next-gen firewalls will come pre-configured with OWASP rule sets. So OWASP, which is the Open Web Application Security Project, they produce some rule sets for protecting against their the most common attacks out there. And I've seen next-gen firewalls that come with the capability to simply enable OWASP rule sets just right out of the box. I see that in some web app firewalls as well. So a web app firewall is a deep packet inspection firewall that moves beyond port protocol inspection and blocking. It basically adds application level inspection, intrusion prevention, and brings intelligence in from outside the firewall. So in the case of a cloud provider, Azure is the best example I can give you. The web app firewall has some capability to bring in some of that external intelligence in Microsoft's security stack. So basically, you've got firewalls that are benefiting from AI and machine learning in that case potentially. So that intelligence. When you hear intelligence in the world of cloud, they're typically talking about intelligent security. Usually maps to AI, machine learning, heuristics, that user and entity behavioral analytics. So speak of the devil, let's talk about user and entity behavioral analytics. So entity behavior is basically collected, it's put into a threat model. The model establishes a baseline of normal activity for the entity. The entity could be a user, it could be a device, but it's establishing a baseline of normal. And Yuba may need some time to establish that baseline. It could need, a couple of weeks or more. And it can conduct an analysis to uncover more details around anomalous events, around unusual events. So the entity behavior is collected and input into a model. It establishes a baseline. And automated investigation also exists in some platforms. You'll see in the world of endpoint detection and response, EDR, it's now been expanded to XDR, which is extended detection and response. And that's due to the fact that your endpoint solutions nowadays, by and large, are leveraging AI and machine learning and Yuba functionality. So threat intelligence, I mentioned threat feeds. That's what I'm talking about here. So threat intelligence at the highest level are all the activities an organization undertakes to educate itself about the changes in the threat landscape. A lot of times that can come in part through a feed that contains information about malicious entities that are ingested by the organization's cybersecurity tools. These threat intelligence feeds will bring in information, usually from multiple sources. Sometimes it'll be open source intelligence. You'll have some solutions that will will kind of crowdsource that data from its subscribers. I've even seen organizations in the financial services world where a consortium will privately set up threat intelligence gathering and then share that information amongst themselves privately. But a single feed's typically comprised of many sources to try to enrich the organization's database of malicious entities and activities. So an entity could be an IP, a website, a threat actor, a file hash, or a lot more. There's a security information event management system I work with that recognizes more than 20 types of entities. So just know that an entity at its basic level, IP, website, threat actor, file hash, endpoint. So the role of artificial intelligence and machine learning may come up. Basically AI and machine learning are used in analyzing and improving cybersecurity postures because the need to process data really goes beyond human scale. A person can't keep up, and that's where AI-based tools for cybersecurity have emerged everywhere to really help teams to reduce their risk and improve their posture by doing a lot of the heavy analysis for them. So along with AI, machine learning has become critical through its ability to analyze millions of events and identify many different types of threats much more reliably and exponentially faster than a person could. So quickly analyzing millions of events. And if you look at some of your major cloud platforms, I'm going to pick on Microsoft because they publish this data. Microsoft claims to process more than 8 trillion signals a day, and they share that information back to their customers through their services. So you'll see that sort of activity in principle across multiple platforms. It's not purely a Microsoft thing. And then going down that road, with the information that's gathered there, the system can build histories of behavioral profile on users, on assets, on networks, and use AI to detect and respond to deviations from normal. Right? It's using machine learning to build a baseline of normal, and then with AI detecting deviations from established norms. And in the 2018 exam, I do remember that they talked about antivirus as though sometimes, occasionally an antivirus might include AI and machine learning. And I think even in the 2018-2019 timeframe, that was very common in antivirus. It was the norm because the reality is most threats that are detected by your antivirus today haven't been seen before. They're not detected by a signature. They're detected through help from AI and ML and AI, machine learning, and UBA, that user and entity behavioral analytics and heuristics, so intelligence in a word. So just know that AI and machine learning factor in anti-malware and security information event management systems, intrusion prevention systems, identity as a service, and much more. It's pervasive at this point. All right, so big finish here. Let's talk about software development security and the changes or additions in 2021. So 8.2, identify and apply security controls in software development ecosystems. So we see in there program languages, libraries, tool sets, integrated development environment, runtime, code repositories, continuous integration, and continuous delivery, often abbreviated as CI/CD. Security orchestration, automation, and response. We covered SOAR back in Domain 3 because I wanted to talk to you about SOAR with SIEM at the same time because those two components are delivered together. So consider SOAR, the SOAR box checked off. And then software configuration management. So we need to talk about all of these new topics in an existing subdomain effectively. So code repositories. This is where your source code and your related artifacts like your libraries are stored. So how do you handle source code securely is the question you really want to be able to answer. Don't commit sensitive information to your code repository. We're not going to store secrets on disk, right? We want to protect access to our source code repository. So we need to have role-based access control. We need to have authentication and authorization in place. Sign your work. Code signing is a form of integrity. Keep your development tools, your IDE, your development environment up to date. So that might be Visual Studio. Visual Studio Code is the most common IDE today. Maybe you're old school and you're using Notepad++. Whatever you're using to write your code, your IDE, keep it up to date. Most code repositories in the world today use Git, which is the most widely used modern version control system. It was actually Git was invented by Linus Torvalds, the inventor of Linux. But that's integrated development environment, and that's all I'm going to mention about it there. So the main thing you need to know from a security perspective about your IDE is keep it up to date, keep it patched. Code libraries, which I mentioned a moment ago, for some important core functions, code libraries can actually improve application security and reduce risk versus writing a function from scratch. So for example, certain languages can be prone to certain kinds of attacks. So C is an example. They use safe memory allocation and string manipulation libraries to reduce the risk of buffer overflow attacks. Other good uses for good examples of where a library could fit in and improve our security. Libraries that help us with encryption or handling secrets or bulk data transfer. Utility functions that are very important that somebody else has probably already written more effectively and completely than we could. So when we get to talking about code scanning, I'll mention runtime. So let's just talk about what runtime is exactly. So runtime describes the period of time during which a software program is actually running. So this is where dynamic application security testing evaluates the security of an application while it's actually running. Assessing software security at runtime is oftentimes the only option for purchased software because you don't have access to the source code. But when you have access to the source code, both source code and runtime scanning, doing both of these is a best practice. You want to scan your code and look for vulnerabilities, poorly written code that may be prone to buffer overflows, for example, or injection. We see forms that don't have proper input validation. That means they may be primed for injection attacks. For containers, when we're thinking about Docker and Kubernetes, scanning our container images at build time is important because many times in the container world, your container is built. Your container image is built on base images that come from the open source world. So you want to make sure there's no malware all the way down through the layers of your container image, and you want to have a solution to scan the runtime environment to make sure your containerized application is secure and proper isolation is in place. I don't think you need to know quite to that level of detail, but what I wanted to impress upon you here is when it comes to code, if you have access to the source code, you want scanning there. You want to also scan runtime. We'll talk about how that happens together. And then for containers, I just wanted to mention similar reality. We need to scan our images at build time and at runtime. So CI/CD, you're going to hear this phrase a lot in the world of DevOps and DevSecOps. This is continuous integration and continuous delivery, sometimes continuous integration and continuous deployment. The D may be expressed differently depending on who you're talking to, all means the same thing. So securing our delivery pipeline. CI/CD is how we deliver frequent and effective application releases, multiple releases a day, for example. So to secure that pipeline, that release pipeline, we call it, we need to implement identity and access management, including MFA. We need to make sure we're restricting who can get into our pipeline to see and edit that configuration. So authentication and authorization. We need to store secrets securely and scan our code to make sure we don't have hard-coded secrets. You don't want hard-coded secrets in your code. You don't want to store them on disk. Implement role-based access control, least privilege access into the environment. So you may have a small number of people that have the ability to reconfigure your delivery pipeline, and you have others that can come in and maybe run your pipeline, and others that can maybe only read the pipeline. Automating vulnerability scanning in your pipeline is an excellent idea, and most of your platforms that provide CI/CD, a platform for CI/CD, many of these platforms have some sort of automated vulnerability scanning capability, either natively or through a third party that you can plug into the pipeline to scan at the appropriate time, so you can scan your source code, etc. And release versioning will improve recoverability and also tracking issues. If you have a well-established versioning system for your software, I don't believe on an exam like the CISSP you're going to be tasked to talk about effective versioning in detail. But just know that release versioning will improve recoverability because you'll be able to track issues against different versions of your software. And this can help you track current issues, but also spot regression bugs, so bugs that resurface that were maybe present in an earlier version and written out and somehow creep back. So let's talk about configuration management. So configuration management tracks the way systems are set up, both for hardware and software and OS and application settings. Software configuration management is a phrase you might hear. You might also hear it expressed as security configuration management. Focus on the configuration management piece, okay? So baselining is an important component of configuration management. It's effectively a snapshot of an application or a system with an application on it at a given point in time. You should also create artifacts that might be used to help understand the system configuration. This can be documentation. This can be a diagram. And within configuration management, system level versioning, component level versioning to establish the software, hardware, and configuration versions of a system, so you know what you're running on today, and you can roll forward and roll back, should you have problems in a release. So applications depend on compute resources and software components. So your configuration management is going to cross that boundary between hardware and software. They both need this capability, and you need it in an integrated sense to basically track the configuration across an entire system. So on a web server, for example, I want to know, what version of different frameworks I'm running, what version of Java, what JVM am I running? If I'm running the .NET framework, what version is that? What version of my web server do I have there? The OS, the patch levels, etc. All of that can be important because your software will have certain dependencies. So let's talk about code scanning. So there's static application security testing. So this is analyzing computer software performed without actually executing programs. So the tester basically has access to the underlying framework, the design, the implementation. So the key characteristic of static application security testing is it requires source code. Dynamic application security testing, on the other hand, is a program that communicates with a web app. It executes the application. It is testing the application at runtime, right? While the application is running. So that's the runtime piece, right? The tester has no knowledge of the technologies of the framework the application is built on. No source code required. It's a runtime test. You'll sometimes hear static application security testing as something that tests inside out. You'll also hear dynamic testing as outside in. You may also hear this expressed with the legacy terms, with static testing being white box testing because you have all answers, and dynamic testing being black box testing because you have none of the answers. And that does it for Domain 8 and our coverage of what's new in the CISSP 2021 edition. I hope you're enjoying the series. I hope you get value out of this video. And now that you have the path forward in 2021, wish you best of luck on the exam. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments. Find me on LinkedIn. And until next time, take care and stay safe.